Members of our next panel, please come to the front of the room. I see Reggie, Bill, Rudy, and Tom. Sit right here. You're going first, Rudy.
No.
Wonder where you went.
We need water too, you know.
Hey, Reggie.
Look at you. Well, I didn't.
Hey, Tom. How's it going?
How are you? What's going on? Here's the appropriate on the left side of the panel. Well, I mean, do it. Swap hands here. Just tell me I came from that family. But it dresses that pretty well. Checking for suspend.
All right, for the closing program for the first day, I think this could be some fun. For those of us who followed the 2015 Kentucky General Assembly and the passage of Senate Bill 186, which has been a prominent item and issue that we focused at this conference, I think this next panel will be very interesting. As Kim Collins overviewed, but I'll also include in my introduction, in 2014, Environment and Energy Secretary Len Peters appointed an oil and gas work group to evaluate Kentucky's industry regulations and recommend changes to the industry's regulatory framework. The work group was chaired by Commissioner Steve Homan, and I think that I've seen Steve at the meeting. Is Steve in the room right now? He may have stepped out, but very capably, ably, and quite amazingly chaired by Steve Homan and managed. And the work group included representatives from the Division of Oil and Gas, Kim Collins and Marvin Combs, the Division of Water, the Secretary's Office of General Counsel, the Kentucky Farm Bureau, the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, the Environmental Quality Commission, of course KOGA, and the gentleman on this panel. Rudy Vogt, Cumberland Valley Resources and KOGA Board President. Bill Barr, BlackRidge Resources and Chairman of KOGA's Government Affairs Committee. Reggie Van Stockum, Esquire, private practice in Shelbyville, Kentucky, and Tom FitzGerald from the Kentucky Resources Council. Over 6 months, the members of the work group collectively contributed over 500 hours to the effort. At the end of the process, the Kentucky Oil and Gas Regulatory Modernization Act was introduced in the Kentucky General Assembly and passed both houses unanimously. Our friend and a friend of the industry, Rocky Atkins, has called it a white paper on how to get legislation passed. If it looked relatively easy once it was introduced, it's because the disagreements were aired in the work group. Proposals and counter-proposals were offered, compromises were made, and eventually consensus was reached. We wanted to give our members and meeting attendees and industry supporters some flavor of how that process worked. And so we've asked these gentlemen to mix it up over the issues, debate and disagree, and discuss what was accomplished the last go-around and what issues are in front of the work group's second phase. We call it KOGA Crossfire for a reason. Those of you all that remember the CNN show in the 80s and the 90s with Bob Novak and Michael Kinsley, you know, that's sort of some of the flavor that we're looking for here in terms of very principled discussion. We'll probably see some disagreements, and we're going to have quite a debate, I believe, on the topics that we've already covered and some topics we'll have facing us in this next phase. I'll moderate the discussion, but I expect it'll take on a life of its own. About halfway through and at the end, I'll ask if anyone has a question for the panel, so please think of questions that you'd like to have asked. And with that, we'll begin the crossfire with a question to Rudy Vogt and to each member of the panel. Rudy, what do you think the most significant accomplishment was of the work group in the first phase?
Let's see, is that coming through all right? Okay.
Yeah.
I went back to look at a lot of it and kind of had to come back with that question, look at two different directions. As far as the most significant thing representing small operator was the definition of a high volume frac. That 320,000 gallons, in my opinion, set what the typical small operator does in Kentucky away from the potential new development going on, potentially protects the small operator, and I think it's shown out in our legislation that a lot of the things that will be required when you do reach those thresholds are not going to be required of the small operator doing small fracs. I think, in my opinion, that's probably the most important thing that came out of this is in protection of the small operator in the existing operations in Kentucky. Now, let me back up. There's one other angle to this thing, and I kept thinking about was what's going to affect small operators more than anything else. And I keep going back to the new reclamation requirements that have been put forth. I think we've talked about them before, and Marvin and Kim discussed them. We now, as small operators in Kentucky, will not be able to go out and start a bulldozer and build a location. We're going to have to put thought into how locations are built, what makes sense from a reclamation standpoint, and it's going to be a learning curve for small operators. So two-faced, sorry, no easy answer.
I'd like to pose that question to Reggie next, please. Reggie, most significant accomplishment that you saw coming from the first phase of the work group?
The most significant accomplishment from the first phase of the effort was that which was not addressed, and that's the elephant in the room. You don't need to spend much time looking at the news and listening to Steve Gardner to know that there are a lot of issues out there that need to be examined, fleshed out, and addressed if we're going to have the confidence of the public in what the regulatory community is doing in regards to this industry. So we didn't cover drinking water contamination, potential contamination in the aquifers to any great extent. We ran away from seismic effects, although there's no reason to do that. We did address the secret sauce argument that you hear out in the general public as to some of the chemicals that are in the frac fluids, and that was a very productive discussion and result. We didn't get into talking about these very valuable natural gas liquids and how we can move them through the state of Kentucky to benefit the economy in the state. And we didn't talk about greenhouse gas contribution. And we didn't because they're too hot a subject. And yet it is the subject that is most on the mind of the public and the subject that angers the public the most. And my suggestion to my colleagues in this panel is we have a really wonderful opportunity here. We haven't faced the onslaught of fracking and horizontal drilling and the incumbent issues related to that in other states that we've seen in Pennsylvania, New York, in North Dakota. We can look at their example and recognize that we can avoid those problems, or at least avoid that tenor in the discussion, if we just acknowledge that the issues are real. And if the issues are real, we ought to examine them to see if there is something that we as an industry can do, or we as a public can do, or we as a regulatory body can do. So the most significant thing to come out of the first phase of this is what we did not address.
Tom?
Just by way of putting my thoughts in context so you can completely ignore everything I say after this. This is my 43rd year as an environmental advocate. I cut my teeth dealing with the Surface Mining Act. As Steve knows, we've been colleagues for many, many years on a lot of these issues, and I really appreciated his perspective and some of his thoughts on cutting through the rhetoric and getting to the science and getting the stories out where there are good stories to tell. I never see the good stories. People don't call me because their air is clean, because the brook is babbling, and because they're having a great day. So my perspective is somewhat tilted maybe by the fact that I see people who are in crisis because their home, their family, their health, their water supply, the things they value most have been put in jeopardy by somebody else's carelessness. And it's my job, for better or worse, to try to fix the immediate problem and to try to assure that other people are not similarly jeopardized in their ability to live their lives the way that we would all hope to live ours. It has been 21 years, by my reckoning, since any significant reform and updating occurred in the oil and gas regulatory framework. And I think the most remarkable accomplishment in the 7-month period that we sat down and did these roundtable negotiations and discussions was the good faith that was brought to the table by all of the parties, the compromises that I think were responsible compromises that were made to advance the values that I was hoping as director of the Resources Council on behalf of the people that I have and do represent to bring forward, which is to provide for the orderly development of oil and gas resources, to protect the correlative rights of surface and mineral owners, and to address the environmental concerns that are associated with this particular extractive industry and with the transportation, the storage, and the utilization of the resource. So from my standpoint, is there work left to be done? Yes, there's some significant issues, some of which we have the ability to meaningfully affect, others of which were on Reggie's list that we really don't have the ability to have a meaningful impact on. We've outlined those issues, and I would encourage all of you to look at not only the Resources Council's priorities for this next round of discussions, but also the priorities of the other stakeholders who are involved. It was not an easy process, but it was a very worthwhile process, and I think a great advances have been made in terms of the substantive issues. The most important ones from my standpoint were assuring transparency for the use of high volume hydrofracking in terms of the chemicals that are utilized, in terms of the pre and post testing of water supplies near the well bores, which is the area where I've seen the greatest level of concern regarding the possibility of migration of injected fluids into non-target zones, including drinking water sources, and the establishment of the abandoned tank battery fund, which as yet is not funded, but we have put in place the framework for addressing abandoned tank batteries, because that is a significant concern to a lot of the landowners. I'm sure people that you come in contact with is when a tank battery is abandoned and how to reclaim the area so it can be put into beneficial use.
Well, probably that was surprise number 2. Surprise number 1 is the fact that after almost 20 years of never having a long boat necktie on, I showed up in honor of my friend Reggie wearing a necktie as symbolic of what this was all about. I'm going to go just a little higher off the deck than my fellow panelists and say that when you start to expect that you know a response from a person or an entity or a regulatory body, I suggest you set yourself up for surprise and disappointment. So just like each of you, and certainly Reggie, expected, anticipated, and would have bet the farm that Bill Barr would be on this panel wearing a bow tie, shock and awe happens. And this group came together. Tom FitzGerald and I agreed more times than we disagreed for a 7-month period. And when we disagreed, we agreed to disagree when we could not reach common ground. So I want to say that the biggest accomplishment of the group, besides getting me to wear a necktie, was the idea that we worked together, built consensus, and it wasn't just a couple of environmentalists and a couple of oil and gas guys. It was head regulators from water, from the cabinet, from the division, from the Office of General Counsel, to the Kentucky Farm Bureau, to the coal industry. It came together repeatedly for a 7-month period and left with a piece of legislation and regulations that satisfied no one, but accomplished a lot. In keeping with that, anytime you run, and these lights are bright, but I know there are at least 2 or 3 registered lobbyists in the group, run a piece of legislation through a partisan legislative body, 2 chambers, 2 committees, multiple hearings, and have not one, not a single vote against that legislation, and you've done a good job of building consensus and selling the product of that group. All of the panelists have already addressed a lot of issues, and I'll move on just to say that this wasn't a 7-month process. I think we signed on believing it was a 1-year process. I now believe it's a 5-year process. I hope we can get it done in 5 years. So it's a multiple year process, and Reggie, you're right. A lot of things we didn't accomplish. I submit to you that we'll disagree that we didn't run from them. We were smart enough to tackle what we could accomplish in year 1 and come out of the gate successful and winners. And the state of Kentucky, the oil and gas industry, all the stakeholders, the environmental groups, the citizens of Kentucky won this year as a result of this work group.
And Andrew, if I may just second that observation, Steve Homan did a magnificent job running this task force. There are diverse opinions. Anytime that I am able to make Tom FitzGerald the moderator on the discussion, I've accomplished something that surprises me. And Steve Homan allowed the kind of back and forth in discussions that enabled all of the different opinions to come forward in a way that consensus could be reached to move forward, and a very successful consensus. In fact, I'm very familiar with reg-neg operations. They came in the third way Clinton administration in the 1990s. Can't we all just get along? Why don't we come together and put our arms around each other, have a group hug, and see if we can work this stuff out? Most of the reg-neg activities that have gone on in the past, I won't say most, I say many are illusory, that they're really just reflections of political power within an organization, an administration in any one state. You can get something that looks like a consensus when in fact it's a one-sided result. That's not what happened here. Steve Homan just did a terrific job, and with Andrew and Rudy on one end of the table with their very able spokesman Bill Barr, Tom FitzGerald on the other end of the table with the years of experience that he had, it was a terrifically energizing and engaging discussion. And I agree with Bill Barr. If he'd only worn suspenders, he'd have made it to my level. But apparently he doesn't know how to eat more.
Well, okay, so Reggie, you, I think that it's fair to characterize in the first phase, but also kicking off the second phase, that you've staked out a pretty aggressive position or philosophy of the industry's responsibility in these negotiations, and I think that's a fair term to use and a fair characterization of some of the ways that you have framed the discussion in this next phase. But you've also, argument that I've heard in that is that ultimately the responsibility the industry takes within this process over the long run accrues benefits to the industry and to things going forward. I'm just interested, could you share some thoughts and justifications on that position that I seem to have believed that you've articulated. If I've misstated anything, please clarify or correct.
You have not, and I appreciate the opportunity to jump in. Here's the first one to my friends and colleagues in the industry. The regulatory authority that regulates your activities are your best friends. They are your best friends. And the fact that we don't have a national program to level the playing field makes their presence even that much more important. A number of times in our discussions, we would be hearing complaints about an inspector saying this or an inspector saying that. And my response was consistent. Congratulations, regulatory agency, you got an inspector out there. These inspectors, the regulations that we're working on, protect you. They support you. They keep you insulated from the argument in a private lawsuit that you're ultra vires without authority in your operations. And when I look at the agency and I look at the funding for the agency to regulate your activities, instead of embracing their activities like we just saw the Division of Transportation get embraced by the legislature, saying hire more engineers, pay them more to regulate our activities. Instead of hearing that from you all, hire more engineers, get more inspectors on the field, keep us right with God, I hear the opposite. We don't want to see the inspectors. They irritate us. They trouble us. We don't want to see any more regulations. They hamstring us. They keep us from operating with the flexibility that we want. We're small operators. We can't afford to do it the way that the bureaucracy wants us to do it. When in fact, I believe the logic is the exact opposite, and that the more mature a regulatory system that you have in detail, the more you see your inspectors, the more you toe the line, the better your permits are to reflect that you are doing what the law requires and therefore gives you a permit shield defense if you're ever sued, the more the better. Now, that being said, let me say this also, so you understand where I come from in relationship to where Tom is. I think that fracking and horizontal drilling can be done responsibly. I think the science, the technology, and the experience in the industry is there. It is much different than surface mining, mountaintop removal. It is much different. And there's a long, long history of good technology in these wells. I think natural gas liquids are exceptionally valuable, Tom, exceptionally valuable, and can be carried through the state of Kentucky safely in a way that could cause the bloom of a new industry, no, not a new, but an expanded chemical industry in the state of Kentucky using what you guys are pulling out of the ground, liquid gold. This is not, I mean, these are basic chemicals, and they're coming through at really inexpensive rates so that they don't have to be made from scratch by industries that can utilize them to turn them over immediately to a product. And we could have that in the state of Kentucky if we had these natural gas liquids coming through. I believe that fracking and horizontal drilling has revolutionized global energy markets. It's diminished the importance of foreign oil in this country, and that is a good thing. It has enhanced our production and supply. That is a good thing. And here is what I tell my two sons. This fracking revolution has secured the economic future of at least 2 generations in America. And I think that is good. So why can't I just put my arms around these fellows and say, hey, job well done? Because from then on, it is all messed up. It's not regulated in a way that you all know what you're supposed to do. It's not regulated in a way that identifies real environmental threats It is not regulated in a way that you can go to different states and understand what your responsibilities are going to be. It is not regulated in a way to protect you from changes in political parties taking over the administration of many of the state houses in the different states of our nation. There's no level playing field. So I think you are in you have an opportunity to recognize that what was done in the Energy Security Act of 2005 by pulling your operation out of EPA's regulatory scheme gave you an opportunity to show the rest of the world what we can do here in America to produce energy resources. But unfortunately, separated your industry out from a level playing field nationally, which is why we have a federal government, to make things equally across the states. So I've talked to Rudy about this a number of times. What can we do in this task force since we can't change federal law? I believe federal law will eventually be changed. I think you will all be brought under the same umbrella because there'll be a change of a political party up there in Washington. Eventually they'll get both sides of the House, and all of a sudden, boom, you'll be back in under a federal program. So why not go there willingly now, go there responsibly, and go there intelligently? And look at the issues, look at the federal regulations for federal lands out west. What is the EPA saying is important to them now? Why don't we look at that now and say to ourselves, well, we don't agree, but our organization, KOGA, can put into place some best practices that say we're going to pay attention to seismicity. We're going to support an analysis, and we're going to look at those issues. There are just a number of things that are bothering the public in America that you can willingly embrace in an inquiry form and a best practices form that will get you ready to join what I think is going to be a level playing field some point in the future. And rather than avoiding the issue and just simply saying, hey, it's us against them, those anti-frackers, those earth firsters, it's us and all of the other energy companies. I don't believe it. I would disagree with my friend Steve. I don't believe oil and gas stands in the same shoes as coal. And I certainly don't believe that everybody who is concerned about fracking and natural gas liquids are all wild-eyed environmentalists. I'm not. There's a whole spectrum on both issues.
Okay. Reggie. Well,
would you like me to stop, Andrew?
any response to anything that Reggie said there? I mean, Rudy, you're a small operator. Do you feel like that you need to have a better funded agency, more inspectors, more inspections, additional compliance costs, things of that nature?
The only thing I would relate is as Reggie says, we've had many conversations about it, and Reggie and Tom too, needless to say, have been very kind to listen to my rant of small operators, small scale, things like that. And in my opinion, it's important to try and protect what Kentucky has right now, within reason, needless to say. But and our industry, I think, has always embraced our regulatory side. The problem with our regulatory side is the state. Every time we have some new angle for regulation, the funds that go with it get sucked away. Now, with your all's help, and we fully appreciate anything we can get, I think that's something we need to be working towards is much better funding for the Division of Oil and Gas. And with all the overlap between the Division of Oil and Gas, Division of Water, maybe Division of Waste Management, I think we need some relief there also. And Reggie, small operators do not have IT departments. They do not have the technical expertise to do this. We need to make it as simple as we can, but once it becomes cookbook for small operators, it's not a big deal, but we need help to do that. EPA has already attacked us with huge regulation for VOC emissions, and methane emissions are coming, especially for oil wells right now. Now, the initial brunt that came to us from EPA, when you finally get into it and start sorting through it and figuring it out, which the Division of Air Quality has helped us with, doesn't really affect us. It is not, we are not of the scale that they are concerned about. And I think we'll find that the same thing with methane emissions and what we're calling Quad O 2.0.
I think, Reggie, you've teed up one of the real issues that the work group struggled with, representing both the industry and the other stakeholders at the table, and that was how to modernize the oil and gas regulations. And the industry went into this process believing there were modernization needed. But how to do that in a responsible way to an existing industry, recognizing the difference in size, scale, and scope of what we'll refer to as a small operator and a major independent. We're fortunate right now in Kentucky to have a little play, the Rogersville, going on that has attracted the attention of 5 or 6 major independents. They were crying out for changes, for modernization of the deep well statutes and the Kentucky administrative regulations dealing with deep wells. Our deep well regs and statutes did not adequately regulate horizontal drilling in any way, shape, or form. In fact, they were counterproductive. They were put together at a time when we were looking at deep vertical basement type tests, sedimentary conventional reservoir tests that were different and are different than the unconventional horizontal plays in the shales. We had to address that if we were going to save the opportunity that existed in the Rogersville and potentially later in the Maquoketa and the Western Kentucky coalfield portion of the Illinois Basin. And we had to not be the second poster child following the steps of Illinois on how not to regulate the oil and gas industry. Illinois lost a major opportunity because of the inability to move regulations and statutes through their legislature. We avoided that. But we were tasked with also protecting most of you, because most of you don't fall in that large major independent category, nor do I. We fall in a small independent producer category. The risks are different, the cost rewards are far slimmer, and the regulatory scheme had to be bifurcated. And it must continue to be bifurcated to allow this industry to exist and to survive. Your points, Reggie, are and will continue to be well taken, but there are times when I believe that you miss the size, scope, and scale argument between most of your audience and the large major independents.
Yeah, and I like the experience to see that in action, so I understand that. But having a two-tiered system, a bifurcated system, is I think, bound ultimately to fail. And that it would be better now, Rudy, to look in a single system that addresses the concerns that the small entities out there have, to find a way first with best practices and then finally with regulations to fold them into a unified system.
Well, and maybe we can use a specific issue to tease that out a little bit more. And I'll direct this at Tom on water quality. You mentioned that in your opening remarks. You felt that it was one of the more significant accomplishments of the work group. To the point of disagreement within the work group, there were some disagreements on the expanse of it, the scope, and we did eventually come down with it just applying to deep well drilling and treatments. Right. You felt that it probably should go a little bit further. Also in this next phase, you have been talking about the notion of what I have been calling water management, right. Which be interested to hear some more details on that, but kind of to Reggie's point, or Reggie's question, or Reggie's position. First of all, when you talk about the issues, I mean, water quality testing for Rudy Vogt's vertical wells in McGoffin County. I mean, where do you come down on this delineation or this clear distinction between the smaller operator, the larger operator, and being able to come up with a logical, rational bifurcation